Good morning and welcome to Congruent Communication. We're going to spend the next hour and a half or so looking at communication and figuring out how we can be more efficient and more effective in our personal interactions with those people. This would fall underneath the kindness portion of Kent's discussion earlier this morning in the keynote. So, just a little bit about some stories, some things along the way in my life that have sort of sent me this way. About 42 years ago, there was a young gentleman in the Army, the United States Army, and he came across this sign. It says, U.S. Army, keep out. What does that sign say? What does it mean? What's the meaning behind that sign? Anybody? If you're a part of the Army, keep out. That's one. That's one way. Or, I'm sorry? You're going to stay away because this is Army property and you don't want to cross onto Army property. Obviously, the young gentleman, me, couldn't figure it out, so he just took the sign with him and left. And I seem to be enjoying myself while I do it. You know, I was part of the Army. I was not stealing. I was Army property. It was Army property. You know, we just came along with the show. So that was probably 40 years ago. About 12 years prior to that, there was this young gentleman whose father looked at him and said, Don, clean your room before you go swimming. All right, fairly simple concepts, right? Clean the room, then I can go swim. I went fishing instead. I did not clean my room. So dear old dad comes home, and of course there was the initial, you didn't clean your room. And I said, you're right, but I didn't go swimming. I went fishing instead. Fortunately, Dad was an engineer, and he understands predicates and logic and whatnot, and that was the last time I got away with that one. So we have these ways of sharing information that sometimes get lost in translation, or we don't quite say what we actually mean. And we're going to take a look now at how we can become slightly better. First question I have, though, is, except for this. This is what my mom was always telling me. And this is the only slide I'm going to read for the entire presentation. I know that you believe you understood what you think I said, but I am not sure that you realize what you heard is not what I meant. I got that a lot as a child. I still occasionally get it from my wife. So history is sometimes a slow learner, slow teacher. Why would we bother trying to improve communications, become more congruent? So what I'd like you to do is, in your tables, come up with 2 reasons why it's important to be able to communicate. What are the benefits of being able to communicate? All right, 2 minutes. In your tables. Talk among yourselves, please. And not only is it survival, but we do not have to zero-base knowledge every generation. We can learn, because we can communicate, we can share what we've learned so that the next generation can build on that. It does not have to be zero-based every generation. Thank you. Another table. Ma'am. So it helps align visions, align progress, and keeps people going in the same direction. Yes? The starting point for achieving something. Nice. And I just heard her say nice, so I just said that was communication. I'm going to echo that along. Yes, back here. To help us like each other. That's very, very nice. Unfortunately, I come from a country where we're spending most of our time not liking the other half. And I'll try to avoid the conversations about politics as long as we're in this session. Feel free to talk to me later if you want to hear what I really think. One more person. Somebody from back here? I'm looking that way. Yes, ma'am. So to express a need or to have a connection with someone. So absolutely, and I'm sure if we had time for everybody table to share, everybody table would have some very good, positive reason for why we should communicate. Now, next question. What hazards exist when we communicate? It's not as simple as just it might seem at first. So let's take 2 more minutes in your tables and have a conversation at your table. What hazards exist when we communicate?
Just press it once.
I just enjoy wandering around. These are my homies. I love my homies.
Just show you how it works. So basically it's just down.
And we're at time. We're at time. So if we can, different tables. What are some of the hazards of communications? Just one per table. Assumptions. We assume we understand what the other person is saying. For example, my father assumed I was going to clean my room. That didn't work out well that first time. Too much information. Buzzwords and terminology.
Misunderstanding due to different accents or due to skills differences between teams.
So misunderstandings due to differences in accents and skills. And it's amazing we all speak English. And and thank you for those of you who do stop and repeat yourself, because my hearing is getting slow. The older I get, the slower my hearing becomes. Anything from back there? Here comes the microphone.
Misinterpretation. Misinterpretation.
Misinterpretation. What else?
Contextual misunderstanding.
Contextual misunderstanding. We will be looking at context in a little bit. And last one.
Biases.
Biases. We all bring biases based on our cultures, based on our backgrounds, based on our family situations. So there's both benefits and hazards to communicating. What we're going to do is spend a little bit of time together. We're going to cover the satire interaction model. This is a model I was introduced to in '95 that sort of helps me understand communication. We'll practice it a little bit. We'll have a conversation around it, a couple activities. Then we'll look at congruence, metaphor, and if we make it in time, we'll actually have a discussion and a wrap-up. Put a bow on the session. So, the satire interaction model. We talk all the time. We talk with people. Our feelings get hurt. Sometimes we can't remember why. And we occasionally, at least speaking for myself, I will get myself wrapped in a knot and I will say things that make me later go, why did I say that? And so this is a tool that can be used both going forwards to help me understand what I'm going to say, and in hindsight to help me understand where I went wrong in some of my more difficult interactions. The first part of the satire interaction model is intake. This is where my senses detect something in the environment, in the context, whether it's visual, auditory, kinesthetic. I get some information from the surroundings, from my surroundings. This would be most often in an interaction. Somebody says something to me, and I take it into my system, and it makes it past the biases and the filters, and now I have a chance to make meaning. What does this mean to me? So as a stream of words come to me, Roger is not here with us right at the moment, but he came in, introduced himself, and said he was here to help with the AV. Okay, now I have a chance to make some meaning. Okay, the meaning I make is Roger is a friend. He's going to help me with my AV issues. Now, how significant is that? Well, we were working on getting things wired just about up till start time, so that was very significant. It was very helpful. I felt a little relief because there was somebody here who knew the system to help me put my computer gear into the AV sound system so that we could do this presentation in this workshop. And next, there was a response. It was like, okay, cool, Raj, pleased to meet you, and let's get started on this. So intake is where we bring meaning into ourselves, bring information into ourselves. Meaning is, what does this mean? And then significance, how do I feel about it? And sometimes significance, which is how I feel about it, can even go to one other level, which is, how do I feel about my feelings? Because sometimes if I'm angry, I feel like I'm ashamed because I shouldn't be angry. Anybody ever yell at their grandchild and then felt bad about yelling at their grandchild besides me? I'm the only one. Cool. Anybody besides me have grandchildren? Okay, that's why the hands aren't going up. See, new information. I've got a different, see, I was feeling kind of bummed, but now that I know there's only two of us, it's not so bad. My response is much more kind to myself. And then a response. Any questions about this fairly simple way of understanding an intake model? So it's called the satire intake model, or interaction model. Questions? Fairly straightforward. So what you do now is you realize that This part of it is unseen. The meaning and the significance, that all happens inside my head. You don't know what's going to happen. You can't see what's going on. But my brain is processing, creating meaning, and we are meaning-making machines. It seems our main purpose in life is to try to make meaning out of everything. And so how that actually occurs is unseen, and then how I assign my feelings to my meaning that I assign. And I have choice. We'll talk about, if I don't talk about it later, I'll talk about it now. Meaning, there's this thing called the rule of three. And I got it from a gentleman by the name of Jerry Weinberg. And he said, Don, if you can't come up with 3 different meanings for your intake, you need to stop and think some more. Because when you go to the 3 different meanings for intake, that greatly increases your options for what significance you find and how you might respond. It stops us from doing automatic rote responses. This is basically the communication model. I respond, that becomes your intake. From intake, meaning gets created, significance is determined, and a response is issued. That becomes my intake, from which I generate meaning, significance, response. And it just kind of works around in a figure 8. If you would like, I can make this slide deck available via the program committee, which would save you having to take photographs. There will be a little bit of a little bit of work we're going to do on paper, but otherwise the slide deck will be freely available. I may take out the 2 pictures of me where I was in the Army and creating problems. But short of that, most of the slide deck, the content like this will be freely available to the participants of this conference. So let's do a little activity again and work on some intake and some meaning. So I'm going to put up 3 questions, and on a sheet of paper I would like you to answer them. And we'll allow maybe a minute apiece at most. Once I finish asking the question and you write your answer down, please look up and that will be my cue to move on to the next question. Very simple questions, basically numeric answers. Are we ready? How many is several? Write a number. How many is several? When you're done, please look up. I think we have most everybody. Next question. What is a few? And the last question, how often is frequently? And that one you might want to express in terms of a percent of time. Is frequently 20% of the time, 30% of the time, 80% of the time, 90% of the time? So how often is frequently? Does anybody need more time? All right, so now we're going to go to the next activity. In your tables, please create a little grid like this at your table. So for several, what did you write down for several? At your table, who had the highest number? And then what was the range? Does this activity, does what I'm asking you to do make sense? Okay, so let's take about 30 seconds to create the table and 3 minutes and 40 seconds to talk about what you've discovered at your table. So build the grid and then have a conversation and notice the differences and see what stands out.
For us, yeah, there was a very large difference with regards to the range. For example, several was between 2 and 8. And the most notable was frequency was between 50 and 80. So a very significant difference.
So when we use words like this, remember, you all had the same intake. And at your tables, you all came up with very different meanings. And this happens a lot. So don't be surprised when these sorts of conversations happen. We'll get to some tips and tricks in a minute. But first, we want to do one more activity. So now this is a personal activity. We've talked about intake, meaning, did a little activity around intake and meaning, and then significance and response. So what I would like you to do for the next 3 to 4 minutes, this is a personal activity. Feel free to do something you can share, to write about something you can share at your table, but it's not going to be required that you share. So what I'd like you to do is think of a recent conversation at work that surprised you. And try and rebuild that conversation. And think, what did you use for intake? Can you actually remember what was said that started this conversation? What meaning did you make from that intake? Did you stop to think that there could be other possible meanings? How did you feel about the meaning? And then finally, how did you respond? So let's take about 4 minutes and just think about this. Everybody should have paper. I believe there was paper in the backpacks we picked up. Feel free to use that. And just take 4 minutes and think about that conversation you had that surprised you. And step through this model, the intake, the meaning, the significance, and the response. And we're at time. So what I'd like to ask you to do now, please take 2 minutes and please, one volunteer just share what, if they're willing, one volunteer share what they put down with the table they're sitting at. So one person for the next 2 minutes sort of share what they did as they worked through this activity. Next 2 minutes. We're at time. Time, everywhere it's time. So as we finish this activity, and we're sort of at the end of this part of our time together, what's one or two things that just stick out on your mind about the Satir interaction model?
And we went through all the conversation here now, and I'm just asking, do we always have to respond?
So the question is, we've been through all of the process, do we always have to respond? No. No, sometimes you just go through, you create the significance, and then you store that for future use. But in terms of conversation and communication, you would tend to respond.
And it helps.
Yeah, and it helps. And
Who responds?
it does help. Yeah, otherwise it's a very short conversation. In my house, they usually end with "yes, dear." One other thought before we move along. Anybody?
That usually if you're interacting with strangers, you're most likely screwed because there's going to be something you misinterpret.
Yes, and you can also, I'm sorry, there's some people in the audience who may meet my wife one day, so I'm going to have to be more careful what I say. Yes, but meeting people you're not familiar with will lead to misinterpretations. Joe says things, Joe Perold fine lady. I've known her for probably 10 years. She uses words, and I'm not really sure what she means. But I assume a positive intent, and it usually turns out well. So let's take a look at some tips and tricks. Sorry about that. Here's some questions and some things you can do to see if you can get better intake and create a common meaning, and that the meaning you have correlates to the meaning that the other person is using. These will be in the slide deck that I will give to Joe to hand out to anybody who wants it. So, just make sure you take in as accurately as you can, and then check the meaning. So we've finished the interaction model, congruence. We've talked about self and other because that's how we communicate as self and other. Now what we're going to do is add an element called context. So I exist in many contexts. I'm the big brother Ryan has never had. I enjoy it immensely because I never had a little brother to pick on. He's also a colleague. So that's another contextual relationship he and I have. We're both Agile coaches, so we share that context with many other people. I'm a developer. I still maintain software for a production system that I wrote back in 2000. So I have many different contexts. As the contexts change, our behaviors sometimes change. What's appropriate to do in one context may not be appropriate for me to do in another context. And the way we've represented this is on a wobble board. Does everybody know what a wobble board is? Yeah, so I'm going to stand here and hopefully not knock anything over. It's got a little ball on the bottom of it and a flat board where I put my feet, and I'm always trying to balance. And with congruence, what you're always doing is balancing yourself, the other, the needs of myself, the needs of the other, and the needs of the context. And there's various stances you can take to protect yourself or to protect the other person or to protect the context. So for example, I call them wobble stances. If you actually read the material, this is from Virginia Satir once again, and she calls them survival stances. These are things we learn to do as children, and they carry forward with us into our adult life and into our workplace. So the wobble stances, self, other, context. Placating. If you ignore yourself, you are placating the other person. In our world, placating would be the boss shows up and says, this must be shipped on Monday. I need you to work all weekend in order for this to ship. And you go, yes, you're absolutely right. It's my fault it's not ready. I will get this done. It's complete removal of self from this self-other context balancing situation. There it is, blaming. In that same scenario, that would be the boss going, it's your fault, you did it, you have to fix it. And quite often, yes, the finger does come out when people are blaming. It's something habitual, at least in the American culture. We get a lot of the finger while people are blaming you. Not that I have ever been blamed, but I've seen fingers. So that's another stance. So in this case, I am protecting myself by moving the other person, ignoring the other person, removing the other person from self-other context. We have super reasonable. Super reasonable is when we look at only the context. And this can get back to the situation where it has to ship Monday. And that says the whole team has to work through the weekend. Self, other, and then the manager, because he feels bad, comes in also and spends the weekend doing whatever managers do on weekends in their offices while the team is busy trying to finish developing the code to ship. And then the last wobble stance is irrelevance. And that's where everything is ignored. That's when you're in a meeting and you're about to come to a decision and some person says, yeah, but what are we going to have for lunch today? You know, and it just trashes the meeting, throws the conversation, the line of thinking out the window. So these are different wobble stances. Placating, which is sort of I am nothing, you are everything. Blaming, I am everything, you are nothing. Super reasonable, you and I are nothing, the context is everything. And then irrelevant, which is nothing is nothing. Some thoughts on congruence. One of the things to note that congruent and congruent action, congruent activity is an activity. It's something that is done. It is not a state of being. This is not some lofty coach sitting on the mountaintop, serene and dispensing answers to those who come and ask. This is a daily struggle because you're always trying to balance self, other, and context. And okay. So now, next activity. How am I doing on time? We're going to make it maybe. It's the congruence talking. We're going to take a look at a handful of sentences at the table. So think of self, other, and context. We're going to talk about he is difficult to manage. Who's missing from that sentence? Self, I'm not. Okay, so he is difficult for me to manage. What's still missing? Context. He is difficult for me to manage when he runs around the break room screaming. Okay, now we have everybody involved in the conversation. She is always late. Who's missing? Okay, so context is missing. Also, always is one of those words that you can always go, really? Is she always late? And then she is always late to my meetings, something to that effect. Let's take the last two in your tables and take about 3 minutes. What's missing and how can we put what's missing back into the statement so that it includes self, other, and context? Make sense? 2 minutes. And we're at time. Were all the tables able to rework the last two sentences in such a fashion that self and other and context were all represented somehow? So what the next activity will be, moving back to the conversation you remembered at the previous conversation you had, the conversation that surprised you at work that didn't turn out quite like you thought it might. Go back to that conversation and ask yourself these questions. Which, if any, of the wobble stances appeared? Was somebody blaming somebody else? Was there placating going on? Was there somebody missing? Was self, other, or context missing? And if so, how could you include that in the conversation if you were to rehab the conversation? So, does this little activity make sense? I'm getting better at giving instructions. Usually it comes back, what? So, let's take 4 minutes and work individually on this conversation that surprised you and review it in terms of the wobble stances, was everybody, self, other, context included, and how you might have shifted things a little bit. 4 minutes. Let's start as an individual activity, and since you've asked, we'll go ahead and do a short group one afterwards. We're at time. Time? What did you notice about this, about congruence and in making sure self, other, and context are included in conversations?
I think the one thing that we kind of notice on our table is that sometimes you think the context is in the conversation, but it's not actually a shared context or like well understood. So you assume that you have a shared context, but it actually does need to be spelled out more often than you think, I think.
So spell out the context more often to make sure you have an understanding of the context. What else? Sorry?
Just ask follow-up questions to be sure that you're on the same page.
Here.
Ask follow-up questions to ensure that you're both on the same page.
Ask follow-up questions to make sure you're both on the same page. One more, and then we're going to move on.
If all three are present, there's a greater chance that there will be a positive outcome. So, yeah.
Thank you. All three present, better chance of positive outcome. Congruence tips and tricks. Look for what's missing in the conversation, self, other, or context. And make sure that when you're having these conversations, you're working us here now, not them there then. Because a lot of times you'll be talking with someone and you get this response and you go, where did this come from? And what has happened is you have triggered something in that person that takes them back to their mother, their father, or their first bad boss they've ever had, and suddenly you're having a conversation with someone who's not there because they're having a them, then, their conversation instead of us here now. So see if you get one of those, what? See if you can bring them back into a current conversation with you. And make sure you're trying to stay current in the conversation also. Metaphor. Words create frames in our minds. Friday, I'm going to be fortunate enough to go to Pilanesberg for a safari. I haven't been on one yet. I'm looking forward to it. And I hope to see a lion. And you know what a lion looks like, you know. That's what a lion looks like. You can see it's got a mane. I'm sorry, there's the mane. It's got a big beard, and it's on black velvet, which makes it even more spectacular. The words we use do create frames in other people's minds, and so when you think of a lion, you really weren't thinking of that. Of all the things you were thinking of, it wasn't that. So when we use words to create frames, we need to be aware of the words we're using and the frames we're creating. When we use a bunch of words together, we can create a metaphor. Metaphors are giving names of one thing to something else. It's a way of thinking, and we give it everything that's attached to it. So when I said lion, that automatically attached 4 legs and a tail. Kenny Rogers does not have 4 legs and a tail. But nonetheless, that's what you were expecting. Metaphors can be very powerful when used correctly. Or when used, they're just very powerful. And part of the problem is we use metaphors, and sometimes the analogies and the stuff that comes along with them doesn't really fit the conversation. So we use words to evoke frames. We think in frames. And so what we have in frames are roles, which are the characters and relationships, and scenarios that are acted out by those roles. So for software development, we have the roles, and I'm just grab Scrum basically as a frame. For roles, we have Scrum Master, Product Owner, Developer, Customer, Program Managers, and so those are the roles. The scenarios they get involved in would be planning meetings, development, checking in, testing, deployment. So that is a frame for software development. But there's many, many different metaphors for software development. So what I'd like to do is ask real quick, what are some of the metaphors you know about software development? What have you heard about a metaphor for software development? You're going to have to, pardon? Gardening. Okay, what else? Build. Is that what you said? Build. Building. Can I say was construction the same thing? Construction. What else? You're going to have to whisper louder. Sir? Architecture, is that different than construction? Okay. What else? Engineering. What else?
It's a journey with many twists and turns and
Journey.
blind corners.
What else? Okay, I heard waterfall back here. One more time. Waterfall and aging. And then there was one up here a little closer. Reinventing the wheel. So from here, so here's a list of metaphors that we've come up here. Gardening, construction, architecture, engineering, journey, waterfall, and aging. Actually, aging should be a separate line. And reinventing the wheel. Here's a list of some that I have come up with. So the software factory, anybody else heard of a software factory? Yeah. Building software construction, we have that one. Herding cats, software is a game, like a play theater, competition. Growing software, gardening, that was common. So I'm not saying my list is better than your list. I'm actually trying to troll and get more lists, more metaphors for my list. So what we'd like to do now is each table, and I'll put these back up, or pick one. Let's do it that way. Pick one of these, any one of these that we've talked about, from either the slide deck or the flip chart. Each table, pick a metaphor for software development. We will get to part 2 in a second. Pick a metaphor. Just pick one. There is no wrong answer. There will be, everybody is a winner. We'll all get our participation trophy. All right, has every table picked a metaphor? Great. Now, part 2. The bottom list, so I just, at the top, we talk about frames and metaphors. Those are the characters, list, casts, characters, roles, relationship between the roles, and scenarios. So for the metaphor that your table picked, what are some of the characters, roles, and relationships and scenarios attached with that metaphor? And then also, what are the assumptions and analogies that come with the metaphor, and how do they fit software development? So you've picked a metaphor, gardening, for example. What characters and roles exist in gardening? What activities and scenarios do you have? And then what are the assumptions and analogies of gardening that apply or don't apply to software development? So that's the activity, and we'll give it 5 minutes. We're at time. Let's hear from a table towards the back. What was your metaphor? What characters, roles, relationships, and scenarios did you come up with your metaphor?
Right, so we selected the herding cats metaphor. So roles there, obviously there's cats and there's someone doing the herding. Activities is the process of herding the cats, lassoing them and getting them to go in the right direction. So a couple of assumptions that cats are all going to go in their own, they're going to be acting independently and go in their own directions and they won't follow the chosen path. And there's also an assumption that the process of herding and getting them to go in the right direction is actually a positive one, that if we get them to all go in the right direction, then that's going to be beneficial. And I suppose unpacking that metaphor, so we're assuming that like our software developers are the cats that all want to go in different directions and don't want to be herded, and then you need to wrangle and herd them to get them to go in the right direction, and maybe someone like a scrum master or something is supposed to be your person doing that herding and forcing them to go in the right direction. So.
Thank you. Someone else towards the back of the room.
Interstate right, yes. So we chose theatre as the metaphor. And just going to read, we had quite a good discussion. Everything from the diva, prima donna, lead actors, supporting cast, maybe a more waterfall approach where you've got strict acts, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Maybe Agile would be as if it was an improv performance. So had a lot of improvisation. And then looking wider as well, looking at the box office or front of house staff, maybe salespeople. Do they get it right? Do they fill in the right audience? Do they market it correctly? Backstage, your DevOps guys, you have to keep things going. Cool.
All right, thank you. The things about metaphors, I would say, is metaphors are neither right nor wrong. They can be useful, but you need to be aware of where the metaphor diverges from what you're actually trying to accomplish. And we use a truckload of metaphors, which in itself is a metaphor. So they actually, researchers say we use about 6 metaphors a minute when we're speaking. So it's not something you should do away with. It's something you should be aware of and know how to use them to achieve the positive benefit for self, other, and context. Discussion and wrap up. This will be in the slide deck. What were the key ideas? We'll just do this real quick. What were the key ideas in the workshop? We'll do this as a shout out. Communication. What else? I'm sorry? Consideration. Yeah, self, other, and context, and balancing them correctly, congruently. What else? As context change, so do behaviors. There's one towards the back. Awareness. All right. What surprised you in this workshop? Yes, sir. 6 metaphors a minute. Yes, I was surprised. There's a great book by George Lakoff titled Metaphors We Live By, and it's amazing the number of metaphors we have that we don't even realize. It's just so ingrained into our thinking and our language. Wonder what the context was. What else surprised you? Yes, ma'am. that you're not as communicative as you thought. All right? What does this bring up? What sorts of thoughts does this bring up for you? Yes, ma'am.
It gives me a couple of ideas on how to better communicate with my team and get my team to communicate with each other.
Better ideas for communicating with the team and the team to communicate with itself. What else? Yes, sir. We need longer arms with faster microphones. And again, sir.
Watching phrasing and context when communicating with others.
Watching phrasing and context when communicating with others, yes.
Wondering what's going through the other person's head as you're saying something.
And so that's, the flip side of that is listening to understand as opposed to listening to respond. Because quite often while somebody is talking to me, I'm already building my response to them without even hearing completely and understanding. Going through the steps. What are my 3 meanings? What is the significance of those meetings? What choices do I have for my response? So you start talking, I'm already working on my response. And then what can we do about these issues? Yes, ma'am.
Improve my wobble boarding skills.
Improve wobble boarding skills, which in itself is a metaphor, you know? Anything else? Sir?
Part of three is make sure that you understand, you ask more questions to get clarity.
Yes, the rule of 3, the power of 3, so that you can get more clarity. Some resources. We're wrapping down the session real fast. We're going to be done. I actually finished on time this time. And for those of you who've never been to one of my sessions, this is an oddity. Usually it's like trying to cram everything in the last 5 seconds. Resources. Coaching Beyond the Team with Esther Derby, Problem Solving Leadership. I've written a few articles on my website. And then Jerry Weinberg wrote a series of books. These books are actually linked to LeanPub, which is where his ebooks are located. And these are the correct titles. If you have the old hardback versions, it's QSM Volume 2, First Order Measurement, and Volume 3, which is Congruent Change, Congruent Action. So, with that, one last thought. Anybody have any last thoughts? Otherwise, we're done here. One last thought.
Spread the love of what we're learning here.
I'm sorry?
Spread the love of what we're learning here.
Spread the love of what we're learning here. Thank you much. Have a wonderful conference.